Now we're going to talk about the formation of Latin Christendom, the Dark Ages. We're going to look at what's going on in Western Europe in the years following the fall of Rome and how the Church steps in to fill the void left by Rome. Here are the terms. As always, make sure you get them. We're now at the point of leaving the ancient world and entering the world of Europe. We're leaving behind the traditions of the Roman Empire, leaving behind the institutions and culture that held the Roman Empire together. Although it's true that certain rulers in medieval Europe adopted some of the terminology and that Charlemagne was crowned the Emperor of Rome, the fact of the matter is that the administration that had culturally sustained the Roman Empire from the 1st century BC to the 5th century had finally and just irreversibly collapsed. What replaced it was to a large extent alien and derived from the Germanic peoples who took over Europe. We also have to look at the fact that we're no longer talking about a unitary rule, meaning one empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the shores of Asia. We're now talking about several different societies that grew up in the collapse of the Roman world. So what was society like? Well, Roman authority had been swept away, but much of the population was still Roman. The people are still there. They begin intermingling with the new arrivals. The Germans seemed to cling to the trappings of Roman authority, as if it lent authority to their kingdoms if they could pretend that they were heirs to Roman power. Many of them took Roman titles like Count or Duke and wore colors associated with imperial households. But there was a fundamental incompatibility with how German and Roman societies were established. The Germans were used to tribal society. Their rulers were chieftains whose followers were bound to them by oaths of loyalty. Remember that idea of comitatus. This was much different from the Roman idea of transnational rule and citizenship, which affected people in broad territories. German rulers divided and subdivided territory, and after they died, their kingdoms were divided among their sons. Within the Roman Empire, a province stayed a province generation after generation. In Rome, a professional civil service had built up over time. After the fall of Rome, this professional bureaucracy just withered away. Urban centers suffered. One of the characteristics of Greco-Roman civilization was their huge cities, with these grand civic structures and a large percentage of the educated populace. The cities were only able to survive because of the support that the Roman government gave them, like importing grain from Egypt and North Africa to feed Rome and the other cities. So when trade broke down, the cities found themselves unable to supply the food they needed. So you have great cities like Alexandria and Rome that just lost control of the immediate countryside around them at the same time, and we begin to see movement from the cities to the countryside, because if you're living in the city, you're not getting food. The infrastructure that maintained the empire and kept everything running breaks down. For example, the aqueducts, they're not maintaining them anymore. So if you live in the city, there's no food, there's no water. So people began going back to the countryside, back to the land, just trying to find a way to survive. So urban culture declined sharply, accompanied by a general lessening of prosperity. The one late Roman institution that survived and flourished was the Christian Church. The Church, in fact, proved to be the great unifying force in a disintegrating world. A lot of Germanic people had already converted to Christianity, and as a general rule, the Germans respected the Church and left it alone. So the church was able to keep its wealth and authority, and it stepped into the vacuum that occurred when Roman authority declined. In some communities, in fact, the church was the only authority figure. And so, the bottom line is people see their world falling apart around them, and they're clinging to something that's familiar, and that's the church. So why did the church survive in the way it did? Well, one reason is that Roman aristocrats who would have gone into civil service, they can't do that now. There's no such career path. Now they're going into the church as a career. We see the Bishop of Rome. This is someone who had an especially exalted status within the Roman world. It was believed that whoever was Bishop of Rome, and this is the highest church authority, had authority over other church officials. The Bishop of Rome, over time, becomes known as the Pope and became very aggressive in asserting religious authority. The Pope was accepted as the senior church official in the West. As you learned when we talked about the Byzantine Empire, he was less successful in asserting his primacy in the East. The property around Rome that the church administered became known as the Papal States. So the church continues to grow, powerful and wealthy. One of the early popes was Gregory the Great, and he became one of the principal architects of papal power. And what I mean by that is he's one of the first and most important of the popes to really kind of lay the foundations for what this position would become. And the power of the Pope would become one of the central issues of the Middle Ages, because what we see under Gregory is that he's building this position up into a strong and powerful one. He's extending papal power, and as the popes, even after Gregory, continue to gain more and more power, they begin to come into conflict with the kings who are also consolidating their power, and it becomes a battle over who has the ultimate power, the Pope or the kings. So this starts with Gregory. Gregory was very active in sending out missionaries, and he was largely responsible for sending missionaries to Anglo-Saxon England. The Anglo-Saxons were the Germanic peoples who had settled in England. He established monasteries throughout the Western world, where the members would follow the Pope and be subservient to papal authority. Gregory also promoted the papacy as the supreme religious and doctrinal authority in the world. So it's thanks to Gregory that the Pope becomes a strong office. There was also a growing trend towards monasticism. The church was growing wealthy, and its organization was filled out with many different kinds of officials. As that's happening, we see the priests becoming much more elaborate in the clothing that they wore and the rituals they performed. And some people within the church were really uncomfortable with this. They wanted to take Christ's teachings about the value of poverty and living a simple life more seriously. So these priests wanted to live apart from the Christian community of the church and all communities. And so they began to form colonies of priests who became known as monks, and they dedicated themselves to a life of denial of pleasure. Strict laws developed to manage these colonies, and these laws were called the rule of a particular monastic community. A number of rules were established, and one of the most influential was established by a man named Benedict, and it became known as Benedictine rule. Benedict established a monastery in Italy in the 6th century. And then Benedictine rule was copied and used by many other monasteries throughout Europe. The focus was on manual labor, quiet study, prayer, and missionary work. Monks were encouraged to go out and convert people in the countryside. And what happens is that we see monks come to be considered the highest example of Christian life and service, and they devoted their entire lives to Christianity. And increasingly, the church was a very attractive career path. It was a way of life that was becoming very attractive to many in what used to be the Roman Empire. Intellectually, the 5th and 6th centuries were a transitional period and not a very productive period, at least as far as original thought. The greatest acts were acts of preservations in saving great writings of early church fathers and the classical period. So here you see Western Europe after the fall of Rome, and you see the various kingdoms that have been established. And this isn't going to be permanent. These borders will shift. These kingdoms will, some grow, some disappear, as these tribes continue to fight for territory to expand their kingdoms. But now I want to look at what on the map says the Kingdom of Odoacer. This is Italy, and it's ruled by the Ostrogoths. Well, as I said, intellectually, there's not a lot going on, but we do see two names that stand out, and both of these were men who were from aristocratic royal or Roman families, and both were Christians. Both lived in Italy and were associated with the Ostrogothic court, and they both served Ostrogothic rulers. So one of them was a man named Boethius. He was known for his translation of Aristotle into Latin. And this was really important because the Greek language was nearly forgotten once the Western Empire crumbled. And the only generalized language spoken by many throughout the West was Latin. Now, we do also see people speaking local Germanic languages influenced by Latin. So it was important for someone to translate the great Greek works into Latin if they were to be preserved. And this is what Boethius did. The other one was Cassiodorus. He also served an Ostrogothic ruler, and he's best known for summarizing and providing classification of many different fields of ancient learning. And what I mean by that is he organized them by topic. He also wrote a history of the Gothic people, and so a lot of what we know about them comes from what Cassiodorus wrote. His work also tried to reconcile Christian and classical thinking. Boethius and Cassiodorus are bright lights in what was otherwise a pretty grim period of intellectual achievement. Here you see a manuscript or a page from a manuscript written by Cassiodorus, and these manuscripts were very valuable. They didn't have paper per se during this period of time. Instead, they would write on parchment, which would be made from animal skins, usually like from sheep or cows. And it was a very time-consuming process to create the parchment. And for example, like a thick book could take an entire herd of cows just to produce enough parchment to create the book. And so it was very, very expensive. And plus, some of the manuscripts were made even more precious by something called illumination. And this term comes from the Latin word for lit up or enlightened, and it just refers to the copiers, the writers, who would use illustrations to embellish or illustrate certain letters or even entire scenes. Sometimes it was just decorative. Sometimes they would want to just enhance or comment on the meaning of the text through the illustrations. And so here you see an example of one of those. There were no printing presses in the Dark Ages, and so the only way to preserve books was to copy them by hand. And preservation efforts were helped by the countless hands of monks in monasteries who spent much of their time copying manuscripts and preserving works of literature. And some of them would devote their entire lives, their entire adult lives to this. And in fact, there were some monasteries that were just devoted to preservation efforts. And it's really interesting because, if you think about it, you're sitting there in one position day after day, very long hours each day. It would get very tiring. And so little comments and notes have been made or found in the manuscripts made by medieval scribes and monks. And I want to read some of them to you. And these are all comments that were found in manuscripts written during the Dark Ages. New parchment, bad ink. I say nothing more. I am very cold. That's a hard page and a weary work to read it. Let the reader's voice honor the writer's pen. This page has not been written very slowly. The parchment is hairy. The ink is thin. Thank God it will soon be dark. Oh, my hand. One of my favorites. Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink. Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back. It dims your sight. It twists your stomach and your sides. St. Patrick of Armagh, deliver me from writing. While I wrote, I froze, and what I could not write by the beams of the sun, I finished by candlelight. As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe. This is sad, O little book. A day will come in truth when someone will over your page say, the hand that wrote it is no more. And so there you have some actual comments from these manuscripts. And as I said, it's really thanks to these people, these men, that many of the classical works exist today. Now, what else is going on? Well, Latin learning was fading among the common people, but it was still held to be important among the church fathers. Christian-centered education replaced classical study like Homer and Virgil. And in fact, the only place you could really get an education, unless you hired a private tutor, was through the church. There were a lot of problems with the Germanic peoples. Many of the Germanic kingdoms collapsed, and they just proved unsuccessful in ruling the world in a Roman fashion. But not all of them faded. The most important Germanic kingdom was the Franks, and I mentioned them when we talked about the barbarians. They began to build a large and unified political grouping, which would be successful in ruling for many years to come through two important dynasties, the Merovingians and the Carolingians, and these are family names. Merovingian rule began with Clovis, who united the Frankish tribes into a kingdom, mostly by war, some by diplomacy. And it's really interesting because he actually began leading his army at the age of 15. And he was very successful in creating a large unified kingdom. He did convert to Christianity, but not initially and not without difficulty. He really didn't want to convert at first, but he was married to a Christian wife who kept needling him. Their first child was baptized, but then fell ill, but did survive. And Clovis himself finally converted after a battle when he prayed to the Christian God and supposedly saw a vision in the sky. And he basically prayed and said, if you give me victory, I'll convert. And so he won, and he and his soldiers were converted. They were baptized in a stream. And then the Franks as a people followed Clovis, and became an Orthodox Christian kingdom. And then he used Christianity as a pretext to enlarge his kingdom. Many of the Frankish tribes had become Arian Christians, as had some of the other neighboring tribes. So he used that as a pretext to conquer them. Basically, well, it was the idea that, well, I need to go and convert these people to true Orthodox Christianity, and oh yeah, I'll just take their land too along the way. And so that's what he did. But it worked very successfully for him, and he ends up creating a very large kingdom, the largest of the Dark Ages. A period of trouble followed Clovis's death in 511, with wars among his successors causing his kingdom to be carved up. One of the rulers won out and formed a new dynasty, the Carolingians. And one of the most important Carolingian victories was in 732 under Charles Martel. Now, Charles Martel was ruling France, but not as king. He was considered the mayor of the palace, and this was a position he held. And he is ruling at a time when the Muslims are advancing on Europe. The Muslims had conquered what's today Spain, and they were invading Frankish territory. And at the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel stopped the Muslim advance. He won, and the line was drawn: Christianity versus Islam, with Islam to the south and Christianity to the north and throughout Europe. Here you can see the Muslim Empire at this time. It's the area in white towards the bottom of the map, and if you notice, it's a huge empire, and it was created in a very short span of time. The most famous and successful Frankish king was Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. He was the grandson of Charles Martel, and he added a lot of territory to the Frankish kingdom. He was responsible for consolidating the Frankish hold over most of what we know of as modern France. And under Charlemagne, for a time, Western Europe had a moment of unity when he built an empire stretching across France, Germany, and part of Italy. Charlemagne was more than 6 feet tall, and he towered over most people of his time. He spent much of his 46-year reign fighting the Muslims in Spain, the Saxons in the north, the Avars and Slavs in the east, and the Lombards in Italy. And in many ways, he was an old-fashioned war chief. He loved battle and was a successful conqueror who reunited much of the old Roman Empire in Europe. When he took the throne, Charlemagne had a number of problems that he needed to deal with to secure his hold. He needed to secure northern Italy, and he was responsible for establishing some very close links to the papacy and protecting it from enemies in Italy. Another danger was the Saxons in the north, who had been raiding the northern coast of France, and even as far south as Spain. And there were just groups of people who were a real threat to French power in the area. After a number of battles, Charlemagne managed to round up his enemies and displace them, deporting them throughout Gaul. He also pushed the French Empire east, extending his rule over Bavaria and Germany, and even subjugating the Slavs. He also controlled the whole northern coast. He laid claim to Brittany and northwest France, but eventually that territory was lost to Viking raids in the 9th century. As he's conquering this territory, Charlemagne is also spreading Christianity throughout Europe. and his control established him as the most powerful ruler in the West. And he was actually at the point of reuniting the entire Western Empire with just a few exceptions. Now, another thing he does is he starts something called the Carolinian Renaissance, a revival of learning and education. And I'll talk more about that in a few moments, as I will about the Holy Roman Emperor. Here you see his empire in 800, and you'll notice it's the largest empire in Western Europe. In fact, he's controlling more territory than the Byzantines were at the moment. Late in 800, Pope Leo III called on Charlemagne for help against rebellious nobles in Rome. So Charlemagne marched south and crushed the rebellious Romans. And on Christmas Day, he's in Rome, so he goes to church. The Pope shows his gratitude by placing a crown on Charlemagne's head and proclaiming him emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, the emperor of all Rome. Now, this is a ceremony that would have enormous significance. A Christian pope had crowned a Germanic king successor to the Roman emperors. In doing so, he revived the ideal of a united Christian community. To the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, though, the Pope's action was just absurd. The Eastern emperor saw himself, and not some backward Frankish king, as the sole Roman ruler. In the long run, Leo's crowning of Charlemagne ended up helping to widen the split between the Eastern and Western Christian worlds. It also laid the groundwork for a desperate power struggle between the Roman Catholic popes and future Germanic emperors, because the idea here is who has the ultimate power? Does the Pope, by placing the crown on the king's head, have more power than the king? Well, a man named Einhard was Charlemagne's official biographer. What did he say about Charlemagne's reaction? That he wasn't happy? That he didn't go to Rome to be crowned? Well, according to Einhard, he went to help the Pope, who was having military problems, and he just went to church. He claimed only to hear Mass. So Charlemagne's later attitude was essentially, if I had known, I wouldn't have come. So he really downplayed it. So there's a lot of debate on why Charlemagne may have said this. Is it because he only imagined himself to be king of France and didn't want to be emperor of all Rome? Or is it that he didn't recognize the Pope's authority to crown him emperor? We don't know. But in this episode, we see the start of a very important dilemma and conflict between the secular power of kings and the religious power of the Pope. The Pope claimed absolute religious power over Europe and a guardianship over all Christian souls. So does that mean that he has power over the secular and political as well? Does that mean that a king has no power to control the bishops of his realm? In the Byzantine Empire, the emperor always claimed authority over church hierarchy and intervened in disputes. In the West, that question had never been settled, but the crowning by the Pope seemed to be an act showing that secular or non-religious power was subservient in some way to the Pope. And Holy Roman Emperor is actually kind of an empty title. The Roman Empire is gone. It doesn't exist. But it did have a lot of symbolic value. To call Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor recalled the grandeur of the Roman Empire, which suggested a connection between religious and political authority. So, what else do we know about life in Carolinian France? This period when Charlemagne's ruling is often referred to as a Renaissance, the Carolinian Renaissance. Now, why? Well, Charlemagne put a real focus on education and on learning. And he starts this renaissance. He chooses the city of Aachen as his capital. And this was unusual because most of these Germanic kings just traveled throughout their kingdoms. But Charlemagne chooses this one place. This is going to be his home base, his capital per se. So when you think of the Middle Ages and you think of the image of a king sitting on a throne in his kingdom, this image really starts with Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne himself could not read or write. He's said to have kept a slate by his bed so that he could practice making letters if he had time before going to sleep at night. And he didn't make a lot of progress with his own writing skills, but he saw the need for officials who could keep complete and accurate records and write clear reports. Education had declined so much that even the supposedly educated clergy were often sadly ignorant, as Charlemagne discovered. He wrote, "We have had letters sent to us from church dignitaries that show a painful weakness in composition. On reading these letters and considering their lack of skill, we began to fear that the writer's knowledge and understanding of the Holy Scriptures might also prove to be much less than it ought to be." Education by this point had largely retreated to the monasteries, places where books were copied and Latin and even a little bit of Greek preserved. Monasteries were the only places where anything remotely resembling the wisdom of Greece and Rome survived. Charlemagne attempted to reverse this trend. He issued an edict to require the monasteries to renew an emphasis on learning and to open their education to the lay nobility. He also supported the foundation of several new and important monasteries. He also opened schools throughout his kingdom for the children of his subjects. Now, when I say children, I mean the boy children. And he encouraged the copying and recopying of literature, which was on the verge of being lost because so few copies were left. He developed a new script, Carolinian minuscule, which was very clear and easy to read, and it provided an effective way of allowing manuscripts to be preserved. Aachen, his new court, becomes the center of this Carolinian Renaissance. It formed an extended center of knowledge and learning. And in fact, to ensure a supply of educated officials, he set up a palace school at Aachen and asked a respected scholar to run the school. A curriculum of study based on Latin learning was used, and this becomes the educational model for medieval Europe. It included the study of grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The scholar also hired other scholars to come and copy ancient manuscripts, including the Bible and including Latin works of history and science. And these manuscripts served as textbooks of Europe for the next 700 years. Unfortunately, this activity did not last much longer than Charlemagne's reign. After he died in 814, his empire soon fell apart. His heirs battled for power for nearly 30 years. Finally, in 843, Charlemagne's grandsons drew up the Treaty of Verdun, which split the empire into 3 regions. The Treaty of Verdun led to the division of the huge Frankish kingdom into what begins to resemble states of later Europe, Gaul and the dukedoms and kingdoms of Germany. So the division of Charlemagne's empire resulted in the emergence of 2 states, ultimately, France and Germany. Although Charlemagne's empire crumbled, the great Frankish ruler left a lasting legacy. He extended Christian civilization into northern Europe and furthered the blending of German, Roman, and Christian traditions. He also set up a strong, efficient government, and later medieval rulers looked to his example when they tried to centralize their own kingdoms.